television. I've seen that ad. So anyway, yeah, and so he's a great guy, and I appreciate you for being here.
You bet.
Okay, so we met, we talked about the bills, and so he's, more familiar with what Congress is all about. And I want you guys to, number one, pay attention. I want you to absorb as much information as you can. I mean, it's a lot, okay, when we're dealing with the law. And I want you making notes. So I will look at your notes. I want notes on every bill. Okay, you can either open a Google Doc or you can get some paper and pencil, but I will take that up or you will submit it to me, whatever your preference is. All right? So after we, lunch is at around 1 o'clock, 1:07. And so what we'll do is I've got pizza coming at 12:45. And so we'll eat afterwards. If we're not finished and we want to eat and work, we can do that. We'll just play it by ear, okay? At 12:15, we have a class. Mrs. Goza's class is coming in. And they'll be sitting in the back. Just wanted to let you know we'll probably kind of continue on with what we're doing. And any questions? Raise your placard. No. All right. So if you do have a question, all you have to do is, raise and then we'll stop and answer, okay? All right. Thank you so much.
Very well. Well, thank you guys for having me. As mentioned, my name is Justin Smith. I'm a lawyer here in town. I've been practicing for about 15 years now. So a little bit about my background. I graduated from college at the University of North Texas. My field of study there is political science and international studies. And after graduating from UNT, I went to Baylor Law School, graduated from there in 2010, worked for a professor about a year out of law school, and then came out here to East Texas. I've been practicing law out here ever since. I am not a congressional delegate, okay? I don't do congressional debate. But this is a process that I'm pretty familiar with. And the bills that come up here in real life would become statutes that apply mostly here on the federal side of things that become law. There's certain topics on here that I'm pretty familiar with. Have all of y'all been through the topics and kind of know what bills we're talking about? So the predominancy of my practice over the last 15 years has been in personal injury cases. For the first 2 or 3 years of my practice, the majority of what I did was class action lawsuits that dealt with the Fair Labor Standards Act. You've got 2 prompts that deal with the FLSA. One about raising the minimum wage and one about incorporating incarcerated workers to be subject to the FLSA, which is the minimum wage and hour time stuff. Outside of that, I've handled cases from car wrecks to 18-wheeler wrecks to products liability cases. I've done some civil rights work for police brutality, for excessive force. So certain things on here that I'm going to be very familiar with, certain things on here I don't know anything about in terms of what the law is. But it doesn't matter, right? Because when you're on the congressional side of things, whatever law it is, whether it's a civil law like the FLSA or it's a criminal law like whether we're going to be imposing adult punishment upon juveniles, what underlies that is the policy. What are our values? What is important to us? How do we want our society to function? And so if you get underneath why you would want the bill, if you're in favor of it, or why you don't want that bill, if you're in the opposition to it, everything flows from there. And for every single one of these prompts, there are reasons for why you would be in favor of it. There are reasons for why you would be opposed to it. And these things are not black and white. It is shades of gray. And it's going to be up to y'all, and hopefully I can help you a little bit, to come to the underlying rationale for why you want it and why you don't, and maybe give you a little bit of insight and context where I can. so that you can be thinking through those things. I'll give you one suggestion, whether it's a congressional debate, or you're arguing in front of a court of appeals, or you're arguing before a district court judge. You only have so much time, and managing your time is so very, very important. And so what I would suggest to you, as you're going through these bills, is to find 3 reasons why you like them and 3 reasons why you don't like them. And I'd come up with 5 or 6 or 7. But of the number that you pick, whether it's 5, 6, or 7, pick 3 that you think are the most important. The 3 that you think are the most powerful arguments for why you want it and why you don't. And then you make your argument about those 3 things. If you find that you have more time, you already have some other reasons in your pocket that you can go pull out and say, okay, here's another reason why you wouldn't want it. I'd pick 3 things that are the most important, make sure that you hit those 3. And the one you like the best, you make it first or last. And the one you like the second best, you make it first or last. And you bury the one that you think is your weakest of the 3 in the middle. Okay? Does that make sense? Any questions about any of that thus far before we turn our attention to the bills themselves and start walking through them one by one? All right. I'm very thorough. Okay. So I figure let's just take them in order. Then we'll turn to the first one. Y'all have a packet that has all these, or if you want to see them up here on the board. And I know that y'all had some questions that were written down. Those were sent to me. I took a look at them. Y'all have some good questions already. I didn't have your questions memorized. So we'll talk through your questions as you have them. And if you come up with anything else, feel free to raise your hand or raise your placard. Let me know, and I'll try to answer your questions as best as I can. Okay, you got it? Everybody got your first prompt up on the bill to prohibit the charging of juveniles and adults? Okay. All right, so let's talk about this system here real quick. This is a federal bill that applies to federal prosecutions of federal crimes. This may be old news to y'all, but there are kind of 2 systems of criminal justice in the country. You have federal criminal offenses and you have state criminal offenses. State criminal offenses are prosecuted by a district attorney's office. We've got one here in Gray County. Every county does. They're investigated by your local police, by the sheriff's department, by the Texas Department of Public Safety, by your state troopers. That's not what this is talking about. This is for federal crimes. There's a federal penal code. That's things for like federal drug offenses, federal firearms offenses, racketeering, white-collar crimes. Those are investigated by agencies like the FBI, by the DEA, by the IRS, and then those federal criminal offenses get referred over to the United States Attorney's Office. Each region for each state has a United States Attorney's Office. For the Eastern District of Texas, for this region, the United States Attorney's Office is over in Tyler. Down in Houston, that has the Southern District of Texas region, and there's about 120 federal United States prosecutors down in Houston that prosecute federal offenses. When the criminal investigative agencies investigate these, refer them over to the United States Attorney's Office. Those federal crimes get prosecuted in the federal district court. There's 3 of them out here in Northeast Texas, one in Marshall, one in Tyler, one up in Texarkana. And the district court judge and his magistrate judge oversee the prosecution of those offenses. You have adults who are charged with federal crimes. You have juveniles who are charged with federal crimes, like drug offenses. And so what this bill proposes is that for anyone that is defined as a juvenile, and thankfully the bill gives you the definition of who's going to be a juvenile. It is anyone who is under the age of 17. So if you're 16 and 364 days from your next birthday, you would be a juvenile under this bill. If you hit your birthday and you're 17, this wouldn't apply to you. What that means is there is a federal penal code sentencing guideline. So if you get convicted for an offense or you plead guilty to an offense in the federal system, the federal court's going to have a sentencing guideline that says, okay, this is your offense, this is the class of felony that you've been charged with, that you've been convicted of or you pled guilty to. And there's a range of punishment that is set under the federal sentencing guidelines for that particular offense. You get 3 to 5 years, or you get 5 to 10 years. And that runs out for adults. For juveniles, they're not subject to the same adult sentencing guidelines. I couldn't tell you what the juvenile sentencing guidelines are in federal courts because I don't do that. You guys can find that out and figure out what the differences are, and I would do that. But there are policy reasons for why you want to charge juvenile as an adult, and there's policy reasons for why you want to charge a juvenile as a juvenile. Typically here in state court, right, not federal court, but for state court offenses, if you were charged as a juvenile, you might get I say incarcerated, you might be confined to a juvenile detention facility. Typically in Texas state court, you would not be confined past the age of 21. And then you would get out. The reason why we do that is because on the juvenile side of things, we don't want someone who's 16 or 14 or who's 15 or who's 13 or 12 or 11 to be incarcerated for a lifetime conviction or for 20 years or for 30 years. We want to rehabilitate those people and then reintroduce them into society so they don't have their lives ruined for some foolish childhood mistake. All right. Questions about this prompt, about what it means? I know you guys had some questions. Like I said, I read them, but I didn't memorize them. So now would be the time to refresh my memory about what your questions are and for us to talk through these things on this prompt.
Okay, will you pull that
Yeah,
up
I'm
for
pulling
me?
up my question.
Thank you. So BK's going to pull those up. You guys should be able to do that as well.
Yeah,
Google Classroom.
go ahead.
So, are there what type of offenses could be charged as, that could be committed by a juvenile that could be charged as an adult?
So on the federal side of things, I don't know. On the state court side of things, and you would want to go look and find out how this works on the federal. But on the state court side of things, there is a juvenile court. And the case can get referred to the juvenile court, and the juvenile court will decide whether or not the offense is charged as an adult or charged as juvenile. What they're going to be looking at are things like what is the nature of the offense, whether it's a felony or a misdemeanor, how old is the person who committed the offense. On the state court side of things, that's decided by a juvenile court. And so it's not like, oh, I got picked up for possession of marijuana, that's going to be charged as a juvenile offense as opposed to an adult offense. It could be charged as either. It's just going to go to a court on the state court side of things, and they're going to decide, okay, this is a 13-year-old, or this is someone who's 16 and a half, and this 13-year-old's got an ounce, and this 16-year-old has 5 pounds, right? That's going to weigh on their decision as to whether or not they charge it as juvenile or adult. But I don't know how it works on the federal side of things. You have to Google it and figure out how that works so that you kind of understand the underpinnings for this. That's a good question. All right, what else? You got your question up, Alan?
No, he has what he
All right.
So I was just wondering, what would be the advantages of charging a juvenile as?
Okay, what do you think?
Guys, when you ask a question, please speak up. Would you say it again, please?
So what would be the advantages of charging a juvenile as an adult?
Yeah.
So, I mean, if it was say an older juvenile, 16 and a half, as you said, maybe if it was a heavier crime, I think maybe that would be an advantage, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
Public safety.
Go ahead, Harrison.
there's like the concern of public safety that goes on, because, I mean, whether they're 16, 15, or 21, they could still be a danger to the American society. So if they're not able to be charged as an adult and they're still charged as a juvenile, then that's like risking a threat to society if they go back into it still the same person that they were before, because of not like heavy enough crime charge.
Okay, you guys writing this down? Because he's giving you your arguments. This is not rocket science, y'all. I mean, that's insightful, and you are right. So you kind of have three purposes that kind of underline, or that people talk about underlying the criminal justice system. You have punishment, or what is sometimes called retribution. There's a vengeance to our criminal justice system. And then you have protection of society. That's a reason for why we put people in prison or in jail. And then you have a third purpose for a criminal justice system, which is rehabilitation. Okay? And could y'all hear what Hardison was saying? More or less? Okay. So what Hardison was saying was that if you've got someone who's convicted of a more serious offense, let's say that this juvenile is not picked up for an ounce of marijuana, but the juvenile is picked up for, typically homicide is not charged on the federal side of things, but let's say he was picked up for homicide. The kid murdered somebody, right? Well, what were the circumstances of the murder? If this kid is a psychopath, if he's a sociopath, if he suffers from some sort of mental illness or disease, you may not want that person running at large. Is that kind of the point that you're making, Harrison? So we might put him inside, charge him as an adult, and put him in a correctional facility for that reason. Okay, that would be a reason for why you would charge someone with an adult. What else? Why else would you might charge a juvenile as an adult? What do you think? Alan?
Did you say murder? Did you mention murder?
Right, a more serious offense.
Okay, so maybe something like murder, rape, etc. Anything like adultery, anything like that.
Okay.
And it's the same thing actually like on adults. I think they'll be charged bigger than adults. They'll be on you.
If it's a more serious offense like murder or like a sexual assault offense, depending on what that is. What else did you say, Alan? You said murder, rape, which is sex assault.
You have to come back to getting on the juvenile.
Okay. All right. Anything else? Any other reasons why you guys think you might want to charge a juvenile as adult? Yes, Hartson.
To dissuade juveniles from like committing severe crimes, serious crimes.
Mhm.
Because I mean, while the charges won't drop to zero or anything, I think that like having a more severe punishment would dissuade at least a good percentage of them from committing those crimes, as opposed to still doing it because there's not enough charge to really care.
Okay. What Hardison is saying, can y'all hear Hardison? All right, so what he was saying was essentially deterrence. If you have someone who commits an offense and that person gets convicted and is charged as an adult and is punished as an adult, people will see that the punishment is harsh and they may be deterred from committing that crime in the future. Yes, Young.
That actually reminds me, I know in Britain, a lot of times, like, I know this is America, but in Britain especially, this is a big problem where juveniles will just get a few months in like juvie or whatever, and then they'll just go right back to doing what they did because it's so lenient on them in other countries.
Right.
And I think America should really try to avoid that.
Okay. So the point that you're making, it dovetails in with what Hardison is saying, which is deterrence, but not just for other people who are parts of the community at large, but for the person who commits an offense. What we would call in the legal system recidivism. That is someone who is incarcerated and then gets out and then commits a crime again and then goes back into the system. That's one of those $15 words that always pull out to make themselves sound smart and fancy.
We need to use it.
Yeah, recidivism.
Can you spell it for us?
Nope.
Okay.
I'm a trial lawyer, I just didn't be able to say it. Microsoft Word will spell check it for me. All right, what else? We've got a couple of good reasons. The seriousness of the offense, right? So we want to punish serious crimes with serious punishments. You've got deterrence for the community at large. You've got deterrence for the person who's committing the offense to prohibit recidivism. There's 3 reasons for why you want to charge them as an adult. Anybody think of any other reasons why you want to charge a juvenile as an adult? What about rehabilitation? So I mentioned there's kind of 3 purposes for the criminal justice system. You have punishment, you have essentially what is deterrence, and then you have rehabilitation. Is there any rehabilitative benefit to charging a juvenile as an adult? Can you think of any reason why a juvenile being charged as an adult might assist in their rehabilitation? Think about what the punishment as an adult would be. If the punishment as a juvenile is some sort of confinement in a non-adult prison facility, like juvenile detention facility, and you may not get confinement at all. If you do get confinement, your confinement is going to be limited up until the age of 21, whereas punishment for an adult is going to put you in an adult correctional facility. Your term of incarceration is going to be significantly longer, potentially significantly longer. Is there any reason why that might assist in the rehabilitation of juveniles? Hardison.
There is a substantially longer time of rehabilitation depending on the crime. Like in juvenile circumstances, you could only be rehabilitated until 21, which might not be enough time for some people. But if you were charged with an adult crime, then that was going to be for substantially longer, which means more time for rehabilitation as a whole.
Okay. All right, good. So there you've got 4 reasons for why you might want to vote against this bill. And there's others too. I mean, you could come up with 12 if you wanted to. But there's 4. Of the 4, I think everyone except for rehabilitation is probably the better arguments, right? Because we generally, I mean, think about this. You're going to punish someone for longer to make them better. And there's a way of making that make sense, like what Hardison said. You may have a child or a juvenile who warrants more attention, more length in the system than what a juvenile sentencing guideline would provide, that the juvenile sentencing guidelines might do a disservice. There's 4. All right, let's switch to the other foot. Why would you want to vote in favor of this bill and prohibit federal courts from sentencing juveniles as adults if they're under the age of 17? Why would you want to get away, to pass this bill? Yes, yeah.
Quick short version of the story. A buddy of mine, he was like, well, I guess since he was 18, he couldn't be tried as a juvenile anymore, but it was a really bum case because he ended up backing his car into some like state senator's mail-on accident. He didn't mean to, obviously, but so it ended up being charged as like a federal crime. And he was under the juvie line. I wonder if it still would have been tried as like a federal crime or not, because like it was a really bum case. Obviously he didn't need to commit the crime. I feel like if you don't need to do something, probably shouldn't be tried as a federal crime.
Okay, so if I'm hearing you right, what you're saying is if the punishment is less, it may disincentivize the U.S. Attorney's Office from bringing the case or keeping with the prosecution of that case to begin with, because the punishment is going to be much less severe. Okay, all right, there's one reason. Yeah, Raheem.
It may not be entirely safe for these youths because they're the juvenile, they might be more of a target for certain forms of abuse, assault, and it could lead them to certain issues down the line.
Okay, all right, did everyone hear Raheem? essentially, if I'm not mistaken, what you're saying is, if you put a juvenile, if you put a kid in an adult correctional facility with a bunch of other adults who've been convicted, they're more at risk than the general population for abuse and for, say what? What'd you say, Al?
Oh, that was.
Oh, Bailey.
I said there's a higher chance that they'll reoffend if
Right.
you have a child who committed whatever it was being a child, and then you put them in with a bunch of grown men who've been there for years, and then expect them to get better when you literally are raising a child in
In a correctional
yeah,
institution. Right.
with animals.
We become a product of our environment, and if you put kids in with convicted adult criminals, they're going to become a part of that group, a part of that culture, they're more likely to reoffend. Yeah, that's a good point, Dale. Very good. We got two. Alan?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I disagree, but I just have one question.
Uh-huh.
So are the kids that's going in the rehab institution with the adults, are they committing the same crime?
Typically. Yeah. No.
Oh, because if they
No.
are, then they should definitely still be in there, regardless of age.
So that,
You kill someone, and a man kills someone, y'all did the same crime, so I don't see how.
But you don't know how to split up the.
yeah, so let's take that as kind of 2 points. One, you mentioned that if the kids who are going into a rehabilitative institution, typically, if you're convicted of a crime as an adult, you're not going into a rehabilitative institution, you're going to a federal penitentiary. You're going to a federal prison.
You're a 16, 17-year-old with a aggravated assault charge in with grown men who are in for the rest of their life for multiple murders.
Yeah, and they could be in from anywhere from, a year to serving a life sentence on the federal side of things. And it would be for any criminal offense, that would be federal.
And now you're bunking with a man who killed 3 people.
Right. I mean, it could be a drug trafficker, it could be someone who's an arms trafficker, it could be someone who, Bernie Madoff, who has stolen, $8 billion of people's money. All of those go to a federal penitentiary, for whatever reason they get funneled into. All right, so we've got 2, Bailey and Carson. Yeah.
Speaking of like juvenile possibly reoffending due to meeting more people that have committed similar crimes or and things like that, they could also like end up turning to drugs because like prison a lot of time, other inmates will smuggle things in and then kids will end up doing that. You put in some juveniles that are, maybe they didn't get charged with drugs and then they get in an area full of drugs and they, chances are, they're gonna be coming back because of people showing them drugs.
Right. They become part of the culture, and then they're more likely to reoffend, not just on the offense that put them in there to begin with, but on any other number of offenses. Whether that's federal or it could be a state offense too. Sure. Okay. How many people think that the criminal justice system does a great job of deterring crimes through punishment? Who thinks that that's really effective? Okay. Alan thinks it's really effective. Does anyone else think it's really effective? Does anyone else think that it's ineffective, that being put in prison is not an effective way of deterring other crimes? All right, Bailey, Young, Partisan, Raheem, all right, Mondragon, Ortiz. Anybody else? Acosta? All right, why? Why do you think it's not very good at deterring crimes? Young.
I mean, like we were saying, so many people get in and then they just, after they get out, they just do it again. And the people that are, not getting out because of life sentences, a lot of time they have the option of parole and, on good behavior, some guy who killed like 20 kids is like, well, I guess I'm scot-free now. Yay. And then he just does it again. And then when you wonder why, because he lost his system and it's very flawed.
Okay. Costa, what do you think? I'm putting you on the spot, but you're gonna get put on the spot, man.
You're the smart one, man.
So why do you think? Why is it not very good? Why do you think the criminal justice system punishment is not a good deterrence for crimes?
Y'all might put it on the level of school. What do y'all think about ISS?
I just think it's not a good
OSS?
system.
Is it a good system?
No,
Sure.
justice system isn't a good system at all. It doesn't deter anyone from anything. All of us right now, if your little sister or your mother was killed, you would without a doubt kill that person.
Perhaps.
None of y'all would hesitate to do that. If someone killed your mother, you wouldn't hesitate to kill that person. And you go to jail for the rest of your life, and you're like, okay, cool.
Perhaps. Yep.
It doesn't work.
All right. Let me help you out, Costa. Think about this for a second. Okay. Let's say that whether you're juvenile or adult, doesn't matter. But we're talking about juveniles. Let's say I'm 16 years old, and I get picked up on a drug offense. Okay. And I get sentenced as an adult, and I get put in the federal penitentiary. I served 3 years in the federal penitentiary. That means when I get out, I'm 19. Did I start college on time? Did I have the opportunity to start college on time? Did I work in some sort of gainful employment while I'm sitting in the federal penitentiary, such that I have viable work experience so that if I don't want to go to college, I can maybe leverage that into getting a job? When I go to apply to a job when I'm 19 years old and I have to report that I'm a convicted felon who has a federal offense and spent 3 years in the penitentiary, and I'm competing with other people who are not convicted felons, who haven't spent any time in the federal penitentiary, who do you think is most likely to get the job? The one who's not convicted. So if I can't get a job once I get out, and I can't earn a living, what do you think I'm gonna do again? I'm gonna turn to crime. I'm gonna do what I have to do with a group of people that I may have established some friendships and connections with in the federal penitentiary, or people who know those people, and I might find myself in a position where, instead of being let out of the behavior that found me in a federal penitentiary to begin with, I'm further entrenched in a system that encourages me and almost potentially mandates me to commit another offense. That is an argument for why you might want to punish a juvenile as a juvenile instead of as an adult. If they don't have a federal conviction on their record, they don't have federal penitentiary time on their record, that record gets expunged because you're a juvenile. You never have to report it to an employer. And I'm out of any kind of confinement such that I can start college on time or I can work a job in addition to that. That gives a juvenile a lot more opportunities to get their life back on the right track than you would otherwise have if you found yourself in the federal penitentiary. Right? Why else? Any other reasons why you think you might want to charge a juvenile as a juvenile? Yeah, first.
Well, prison's like very like one size fits all type of punishment,
Right.
In which where if you sexually assaulted somebody or murdered somebody, you can be put in the same place as someone who embezzled money from company or did drugs, and those aren't exactly the same weight of crimes. And so if juveniles are put in that same scenario at a different timeline as someone else, then that could potentially lead to a skewed view of what they potentially have done or what they could potentially do with their life as a result of being in like the same setting as someone who's committed more crimes like that. Like maybe they're like around people who murder and whatnot.
Okay.
Now they think that they committed a crime on the same level as someone who murdered. And now anyone who like views them as a person is also going to view them as someone who murdered. And so now they are put in a scenario where they can't like escape that, and also like force them into a way thinking that they are on the same level as people who committed real crimes that have hurt people.
Okay? So, in essence, not only do you have to live with the label of a convicted criminal when you apply for jobs, but that label can become part of your identity socially. Am I understanding you right? And so it can affect your social interactions, the communities that you're in, how you're perceived, and what opportunities that you might have available to you, as opposed to if you've been charged and subject to juvenile sentencing. One thing that I would recommend that y'all look at and into is the federal sentencing guidelines, like I said, I'm not a U.S. attorney. I don't prosecute federal crimes. The closest that I've come to that is doing some pinch hitting on an IRS investigation in defense. But I think what you'll find is the federal sentencing guidelines are not flexible. The judges, federal district court judges who are applying the federal sentencing guidelines do not have a post of discretion. They have discretion within the scope of the sentencing guidelines, but they have to issue punishment inside those sentencing guidelines. If they think, okay, this is a juvenile, I don't want to send him to a federal penitentiary, I want to put him into a rehabilitative institution, if the sentencing guidelines don't allow them to do that, they cannot do it, and they would have to push that kid into a federal penitentiary. So I'd look at those federal sentencing guidelines, and I'd look at what are kind of the major offenses on the federal side of things. I mentioned a couple of them, like drug offenses, firearms offenses, racketeering, white-collar crimes. Those are the federal offenses that typically get the most amount of news press. Things like homicide, sexual assault, petty theft, those things get handled more on the state court side of things. But I look at what kind of crimes you're talking about, and then I look at the federal sentencing guidelines, and I take a look at how austere those things are, and those can give you some arguments. We've got some arguments for, we've got some arguments against. Let's go talk about the next one. All right, hourly wage. Okay. Real briefly, here's your background on the statute, the Fair Labor Standards Act. This is a piece of New Deal legislation that Roosevelt passed back in the 30s. The idea is that back then, employers were under no restrictions for how much they could pay an employee or how long an employee could work. And so if you think about, like, y'all ever seen like a Ken Burns documentary about like the building in New York or anything like that? No? No Ken Burns fans here? All right. So you know the big skyscrapers up in New York, okay? You got construction workers who are working on those things. If you can pay one guy to work 120 hours a week and you can pay him a pittance, as an employer, you're encouraged to do that because it's cheaper. What the FLSA came in and did, kind of in response to the Great Depression, because we wanted to get people back to work and we wanted to make sure that they were having a living wage, is it set a minimum wage for the hourly rate, and then number two, it capped the number of hours that an employee can work in any given work week to 40 hours of work. That's your 40 hours a week. That's your full-time employment. If an employer had an employee work more than 40 hours a week, they could do that, but the employer had to pay them time and a half, overtime. The FLSA does that. It also entered in restrictions for child labor laws and has record-keeping and reporting-to-people requirements. Over time, the federal minimum wage has changed a little bit. I think the last time it changed was back in the 90s, maybe early aughts. The federal minimum wage right now is $7.25 an hour. And the overtime is still time and a half. Still everything else is the same. This bill is got problems, okay? And so I would encourage you for each one of these things, kind of go through them line by line. The way that a lawyer would look at a statute like this is we would go through every single sentence of the bill, what would ultimately become a statute, and we would ask ourselves, what is the effect of this? What does this language mean? Because ultimately, once a bill gets passed and becomes law and it's a statute, it gets punted over to the courts to interpret how it applies. So before we go talking about policy for raising minimum wage or not raising the minimum wage, let's talk about a couple of things here first that pop out to me. On section 2, on that second sentence, it's got a definition for what an employee is. Okay, y'all have it there in front of you? Employees refers to workers who live in the United States more than 6 months out of the year and earn 51% or more of their income from the employer for work completed in the United States. If you went and looked at the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is, I think, 29 USC, y'all write this down because I'm going to give you the citation of the statute. I think it's 29 USC 201, section 201. And if you Google that, or you Google Fair Labor Standards Act 29 USC 201, you should be able to pull up a Cornell version of the statute online. If you went and you looked at the definition of an employee under the FLSA now, what it would essentially say, if you could get through all the provisions, is that an employee is anyone who works for an employer who has suffered or permitted to work. And that's pretty much it. And there's some other definitions in there about home health care workers or agricultural workers. But for the most part, anyone in the United States who is allowed to work for any employer, with two caveats, is an employee. There is not any language in the FLSA about you have to live in the United States for a certain amount of time, or you have to have your compensation be from that employer be 51% or more. I know someone asked a question about what about small businesses, and we'll talk about that here in a bit. The Fair Labor Standards Act does not apply to every employer in the United States. You got basically two things, with the exception of agricultural workers and people who work at sea and home health care workers. But for private employers, your brick and mortar private employers, you have to have one of two things met. One, you have to have gross sales receipts in excess of $500,000 a year. So if you don't have more than $500,000 in gross sales receipt, you don't have to comply with the Fair Labor Standards Act. You don't have to pay minimum wage under the FLSA. You might have to pay a minimum wage under Texas labor laws, which are also $7.25 an hour, but not under the FLSA. And the other thing, it's either $500,000 in gross receipts a year, or you have to be involved in interstate commerce. That is because the United States government only has the authority through the Commerce Clause to regulate things in states if they affect interstate commerce. So that's its jurisdictional hook to bring it into the ambit. This is the thing that we can regulate. Right. Let's say that you're working over the summer, right? And you go pull a job over the summer. And let's say you work at two different places. And you get 40% of your income from McDonald's and you get 60% of your income from someplace else. The way this definition reads is that the person who pays you 40% doesn't have to comply with minimum wage laws. So if you've got a problem with this bill that doesn't have anything to do with whether you should raise it or lower it, the way that this definition reads is if you've got an employer where you're working part-time and you get less than 51% of your income from that employer, they're all of a sudden exempted from minimum wage, from overtime, from salary requirements in the FLSA. That is a phenomenal change to the way that statute works now, right? So if you're working at McDonald's and you get 40% of your income from there during the course of a year instead of $7.25, say, well, let's go back to 1936, we'll pay you $1 an hour, right? That is pretty poor policy. I mean, that would essentially abolish the Fair Labor Standards Act for a whole class of employers, and it would do it in a way that would be an administrative nightmare to regulate. Because it's not, oh, well, you're in this industry, so it doesn't apply, or you don't have X number of gross receipts, so it doesn't apply. You have to look at each individual employee, and you have to figure out, okay, this is how much they earn from here annually, here's how much they earn from another employer annually, and you would have to do that on an employee-by-employee basis for each employer to determine whether or not they had to comply with the statute, if this changes the definition of employee of the statute. Does that make sense? Okay? The other thing on here that is interesting, the FLSA has two enforcement mechanisms. One enforcement mechanism is run through the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division. That's the federal administrative agency and sub-agency that is tasked with investigating FLSA violations and enforcing FLSA violations. I'll give you an example. So early in my career, I had a class action lawsuit that was an FLSA case, what the lawyers call a donning and doffing claim. Those things arose in industrial plants where employees would come in and they would have to put on protective gear, and then they would clock in, and then they would do their work, and then they would have to clock out, and they would have to take off all their gear. That time that they had to spend before clocking in to put on all their gear, which was required for their employment, and to take it off, was uncompensated time.
The case I had was against Farmers Insurance and 21st Century Insurance Company. And what they were doing is they had a clock in and clock out system. So that employees who were working in the call centers had to come in and they had to go through a checklist and read a bunch of emails before they clocked into the system. Because once you clocked in, you were immediately getting calls. And so if you were going to do that work, you had to do it before you punched in your number. Otherwise, you were starting to get hit. You wouldn't have time to do it. And they had to do it at the end of the day. So each employee who worked in the call center for Farmers and for 21st Century Insurance Company, which were affiliated insurance companies, they were spending approximately 20 or 30 minutes a day working without compensation. 20 or 30 minutes a day doesn't sound like a whole lot of money, but if you're spending 20 to 30 minutes a day, that 5 days a week, that's up to 2.5 hours a week. And then you multiply that by 46 weeks a year, and then you multiply that by the 3,600 call center employees that Farmers and 21st Century Insurance Company employed, and that turns into a significant amount of money that Farmers and 21st Century are holding back from their employees and putting in their pocket. The Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division came in and did an investigation. The way they do that is that someone makes a report to them and files a complaint with the DOL Wage and Hour Division. And then they'll come in and they'll start their investigation and they request records from the employer. There's certain records that an employer has to maintain. And if they find there's a violation, they can enter a settlement on behalf of the employees, and that would be for back pay that goes to the employees. If they find it's a willful and a regular violation, they can impose a fine, a penalty. That penalty now is about $1,900 per employee, okay? I say that because the second portion of this bill has a requirement that businesses will report to the Department of Labor, which will be the Wage and Hour Division, biannually. That is a change from the existing statute. The Wage and Hour Division does not accept, and employers are not required to send reports to them twice a year, once every 5 years. There's no reporting requirement to them. The only time the Wage and Hour Division gets involved in this is if an employee makes a complaint and they start their investigation. And so there's a problem with this bill, or a potential issue with this bill, with respect to how the Wage and Hour Division would go about investigating that handling. Imagine, if you will, every employer in the United States who has more than $500,000 in gross receipts twice a year sending reports to the Wage and Hour Division. There are not that many people who work in the Wage and Hour Division for the Department of Labor, and it would be an extreme burden upon the Wage and Hour Division to have to go through those reports twice a year to try to find a violation, as opposed to relying upon reporting from the employees and then kicking off their investigation when that report is made. That is different from the way that the statute works now. And the third thing about this that's different than the way the statute works now is the $1,000 per violation. What does that mean? What does a violation of the FLSA mean? In the case that I had, 13, 14 years ago, where an employee had to work 20 to 30 minutes every single day, pre-shift, post-shift, they're not being paid for that time, is that a violation? Every time that happened throughout the course of the year, because that's one single course of conduct, is that one course of conduct a violation? If every time that an employer made you work uncompensated time is a violation, well, for those people who work 2 or 3 years, that would be what, 900 and some odd violations? Well, no, more, almost 1,200 violations, if that was done over the course of 3 years. 1,200 violations, $1,000 a pop, times that times 3,500 to 3,600 employees. That is a significant penalty, right? So, whereas the current statute has a penalty per employee, the fact that this has a penalty per violation, and I don't know what that means. I don't know if that means per employee or if that means literally every single time the FLSA is violated, that's a $1,000 penalty. That would be another $1,000 for every single time the employee came in and had to work uncompensated time, right? Does that make sense? Does all of that make sense? Okay. So to kind of put this in context, right, I said, so what you're going to be looking at is why do you want the bill, why do you not want the bill? These things that have to do with the definition of employee, they have to do with reporting, they have to do with how violations are calculated. Those are all things that don't have anything with don't have anything to do with the policy arguments whether or not to raise or lower the minimum wage. But there are problems with the bill that give you some things to talk about in opposition, and it gives you things to ask questions about as to the person who's a proponent of it. And when you're in the position of asking these questions, the first thing you do is you figure out why I want it and why I don't want it. And then all of your questions are going to flow from that premise. If someone is saying, well, this is a great bill, we need to raise the minimum wage, you can ask the question, how is the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division supposed to process 2 reports from every single employer in the United States who's subject to the FLSA? Do they have the staffing to do that? What would you have to do to increase their budget in order to make sure that they have the staffing to go through those reports twice a year for every single employer in the United States who's subject to the FLSA? You can ask questions about what if you have an employee who works more than one job and they get 40% or less than 51% of their compensation from one of the employers? Is that employer no longer subject to the FLSA? Because that's the way that reads, right? These give you questions to ask and things to argue about. All right, over to policy. Yeah, Daly, Alan, take it in turn. Daly, I called you first.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So, we're on the second one, right?
Yeah, we're on number 2.
It says it's gonna, like, raise the hourly minimum wage to provide a living wage, but wouldn't the price of everything just go up?
Okay, would it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's kind of how it
Right,
works.
why? Why would the price of everything go up?
People suck. I don't know, life, it doesn't seem like inflation.
Okay, let's break it down a little bit.
It's not even
more.
up because
I see you, Virgil.
I mean,
I get
basically,
you.
that's all it would do. It would just, like, give inflation like a running start. There's no reason to increase the amount you're giving people, just to increase the amount that everything costs.
Okay. Alan, I'm gonna come back to you, man. Alan,
Can I get my affirmative speech on this bill?
huh?
Can I get my affirmative speech on this bill?
I don't know. I'm just here to help
He
you.
has one.
I have an affirmative speech.
Okay. You wanna give it now?
Yes.
All right, you give it and I'll critique it.
You want to have a seat? You've been up all this time.
No, I'm good.
So, it's answering your question, Daily. So we all like high-paying jobs, right? We do.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So everybody deserves wants more money than what they're getting. But like you said, there's cons. Everything goes to go higher. So I just had some statistics from some sources and stuff like that. Like for example, Washington D.C. it has a higher minimum wage to help workers make a living. However, these places, the living costs can go up. So just really just an example of what he said. So I hope that y'all vote affirmative on this bill. Okay, I'm sitting down.
Okay, all right. Yes.
Yes, no, go.
How do states come up with minimum wage? All right, that's a good question. I'm gonna come back to this in a second. I want to talk to Alan for just a second about his speech. But that's a good question. They need to answer that, isn't it? Okay, Alan,
I think I'm ready.
number 1, good job. All right, you had the courage to stand up and do your thing. I appreciate that.
Who's negative? I mean, who's voting affirmative?
Who's voting affirmative? I don't know. So here's what I know. Here's the structure that, as I understand it. The person who wrote the bill is going to get up and they're going to give a sponsor's speech as to why why you should vote in favor of the bill. And as I understand it, there'll be a Q&A session where y'all will have opportunities to ask questions of the sponsor, either in favor of, to support your points in favor of the bill, or to make your points in opposition to the bill. And then someone will give a rebuttal. and then someone can stand up in support of the bill. You're on the right track. So when if I'm going to go do an opening statement for a trial, or if I'm going to do a closing argument for a trial, I'll tell you what my process is. I will go through and I'll write down essentially what it is that I want to say, and I'll write it down pretty much verbatim. And then it has all the facts that I want. What I will do, once I have that kind of all written out, because the process of writing that out helps you get the words in your head that you want to use, I will then transfer that over to an outline on a piece of legal paper, and it'll have just the bullet points of what I want to say. It'll have the statistics if I want to use statistics. I don't use statistics in trial, but I have facts. And then I'll write out those facts, and that becomes kind of my cheat sheet, you know? So I have the script up in my head, but then I put the script off to the side. I have my outline, and I say, okay, this is the points that I want to talk about. Let me kind of talk to you guys about what's important in this, and here's the facts, all right? It's a good starting off point. All right. Mondragon Ortiz asked, how do the states come up with what the minimum wage is going to be? Like on the juvenile punishment thing, you got two systems. You got a federal system, you got a state system. The federal Fair Labor Standards Act governs the employers who have employees engaged in interstate commerce and people who have gross receipts in excess of $500,000 a year. If you fall outside of that, every single state has its own labor laws that set what they have for minimum wage. And then you'll have some municipalities who will get involved too and will jack up raise or increase the minimum wage from the state minimum up for, municipal entity. Like San Francisco might increase the minimum wage if you're inside San Francisco. They run through this same bill process on the state side of things, and it gets run through on the federal side of things. And how every single one of the 50 states has gone through this, I couldn't tell you, because I wasn't there, right? Ideally, what you would want is you would want to take a look at what is the wage, what has happened with inflation, what is the consumer price index, and you would raise the minimum wage. And this is people who are, some group of people who are in favor of raising the minimum wage, so that the minimum wage should keep pace with inflation. Because as inflation goes up, your dollars are worth less. As you can tell, since this thing hasn't been amended to have the minimum wage increase since the 90s or early aughts, they do not have this tied to inflation. And there have been some proposals to tie it to inflation, and they've never passed. And so you're stuck with this minimum wage rate of $7.25 an hour. To Alan's point, $7.25 an hour now is worth less than it was in 1990. Does anyone here work a job outside of school? Y'all do? Okay. It's been a while since I was in high school. It's been a while. But when I had a job in high school, minimum hourly rate was $7.25 an hour. The jobs that I worked, they paid like $8.50, $9.25. Does anyone here work a job that pays $7.25 an hour, that pays minimum wage? Or is paying more than minimum wage? They pay more than minimum wage? Okay. I'm not going to ask you what you get paid. I'm not going to put you on the spot, but they pay more than that. So, which one do you guys want to talk about first? In favor of the bill or against the bill? I'll let you choose.
Again.
You want to talk against the bill? Okay. So let's hit up Bailey's point first. Which Bailey's point was, if you raise the minimum wage, does that not have an effect on the cost of goods and services further on down the line? Okay? You say it does, and that's because people are stupid. Let's get a little bit more granular than that. Okay? Okay? Why, and I'll open it up to everybody, why would increasing the minimum wage increase the cost of goods and services?
Well, it would probably increase in, like, the goods and, like, the consumer products because they'll know people will be able to afford it because the minimum wage is like $7.25 or whatever. If they raise it to, like, let's say $2, that means like the price of the candy bar can go up to like $1.50 to like $2 or maybe $2.50 if you want.
Okay.
Because they know people could afford it.
All right, yes, sir.
I believe it has to do mostly with supply and demand. As you get paid more money, you'll be able to demand more supply. And as people are constantly buying these supplies, I guess they would have a shortage if they keep it at the low price, rather than having to raise up to, I guess, balance out the increase of minimum.
Okay, all right, good. And good?
As they pay their employees more money, they have to have money coming from somewhere, so they have to increase the price of their goods, so they have more money for them, so you can pay them a little bit more.
Okay, all right. Same thing pretty much over here. Very good. All right, so we got two rationales put forth for why we raise the cost of goods and services. If you inflate your, number one, if you pay your employers or employees more, that money has to come from somewhere. If I'm a business, if I'm the CEO of McDonald's, and I've got to raise the minimum wage for all the McDonald's from $7.25 to $17 an hour, do y'all think that me as the CEO, I'm going to take a pay cut? Do you think I'm going to take a pay cut to pay $17 an hour? No, I want my cush package with all the benefits. So what do? If I'm not going to take a pay cut, how am I going to raise the money to pay $17 an hour to the folks who work down at the local franchises? I'm going to raise the cost of hamburgers and fries, and that gets passed on to the consumer. To your point, there's another thing. If someone who was earning $7.25 an hour is now earning $17 an hour, their purchasing power is more than what it otherwise would have been. And if someone has more money to spend more money to buy more stuff, then there's fewer stuff to go around, and that drives up the cost of, it's basically inflationary pressures on the other side of things. Okay, there's two reasons for why you wouldn't want it. Anyone think of another reason why you wouldn't want to raise the minimum wage? Somebody asked the question, and I touched upon it earlier. What about small businesses? Your mom and pop places. Because $500,000 in gross receipts sounds like a lot of money, but that's not your profit. That's your gross sales. That's gross sales before you take out expenses. So do you think that if I'm running the local Ace Hardware store and I've got $501,000 in gross receipts, do you think I'm going to struggle to increase the rate up for my employees by $10 an hour? Do you think that might put a burden on my business if I'm just barely meeting the threshold for being under the FLSA? Anybody? No? You don't think it's going to affect me at all?
I agree with what he said.
Huh?
I agree with what he said.
I couldn't hear it. Huh?
I think it will affect you.
Okay. Why?
Because for a small business, as in comparison to these big businesses like Facebook or just big franchises, it'd be a lot, I guess, easier for them to to pay their employees more as they profit more money rather than a small local business that only makes so much money that they're only able to pay their employees so much before they start losing money for other business.
Okay. Apple's got more money than the guy who runs the Ace down here on the corner. I don't know how much money the guy who runs the Ace on the corner makes. But okay, your local mom and pop establishment. What about, yeah, Hardison, do you have something you want to say?
Well, I was gonna say, like the reason why you wouldn't want or think the negative for this bill is because of it leads to mass unemployment as a result of high wages today. Because they either go into the cost of living by having to raise prices in order to pay higher wages, or they don't do that and they have to fire employees as a result of high wages pay, so they have to pay less like people, but with higher wages, which leads to mass unemployment in businesses and private companies as a whole.
Yeah, okay, all right. I'm going to give you one other thing. The FLSA does two things, well, three things as I mentioned. Well, just talking about two. it sets the minimum hourly rate, but it also sets overtime at time and a half. So if you raise the minimum wage to $17 an hour for anyone who works overtime, the minimum overtime would be what? It's time and a half. So 17 plus half of 17, what's that? $8.50. So overtime now becomes, instead of $11 an hour, it becomes $25.50. So it's not just the cost of the minimum wage that the employer has to bear, it's the cost, it's the increased cost of the overtime that the employer has to bear too. All right. I tell you what, you got a lot of topics to cover. So, I obviously don't have time to go through all 15 of these things. We've gone through 2 in an hour and 30 minutes. But here's a point that I want to leave you guys with, okay? For the most part, I'm giving you a little bit of context, but the reasons for why you guys want the bill or you don't want the bill, they're not coming from me for the most part, y'all. You guys are coming up with the reasons for this. And you guys are smart. You can look at these bills. You know what it is. You know why you want them. You know why you don't. This applies to every single one of these things. Don't lack confidence in yourself because for whatever reason that you can't come up with reasons for why these things are good bills or why these things are bad bills. Right? For the most part, I have done this over you guys to just give me why you think it is. And you guys have done that, right? You guys know and you have the ability to rationalize through all these bills and come up with this and come up with reasons for why you want it and why you don't. You got all the tools you need to do this, okay? With that said, let's go on to the third bill real quick. You may go for another 15 minutes and stop? Okay. Let me be a little bit more strategic. Instead of going through these one at a time, I'm going to hit up the ones that I think I can give you the most help for. We're going to talk about patent lengths real quick. We're going to talk about the tariffs. We'll hit briefly on the incarcerated workers under the FLSA. We'll talk about euthanasia. Okay, and if we have time, we'll get to something else. All right, so the patent lengths. The bill tells you that the current length of time for a patent is 20 years, and what they are proposing is to decrease the amount of time for a patent down to 10 years. For prescription drug costs, or for prescription drugs. The reason why you would want to do this in kind of a global sense, the cost of prescription name brand drugs is exponentially higher than the cost of a generic, okay? So I'll give you an example of this. There is a prescription drug called Duexis. Duexis is ibuprofen. Y'all know what ibuprofen is? It's Advil, right? But for patients who take ibuprofen on a chronic basis, means they take it all the time, right? Advil, ibuprofen, can cause gastrointestinal ulcers. It has side effects that come along with using Advil every single day to treat pain. So what Duexis is it's ibuprofen, it's Advil, with a gastrointestinal buffer so that it breaks down slower in your gut to try to counter-effect the gastrointestinal side effects of ibuprofen when you take it every day. How much does ibuprofen cost? What's a bottle of Advil cost? Anybody know? $5? Okay, $5, $10? Huh? If that. Okay, $5, $10 if that. What do y'all think a prescription, a 30-day prescription for Duexis costs? $50. Do I have any other bidders? Any other bidders on Duexis?
75.
75. Okay, any other bidders?
30.
30? All right, try $2,000. Okay? $2,000. So, somebody a pharmaceutical company has put a lot of money into research and development, and there are administrative agencies that have to approve medications in the United States to make sure that they're safe. They have to go through the FDA approval process. They have to go through studies with human trials to make sure that the drug is both effective and that its side effects are not so severe that it's contraindicated for a majority of the population. All of that costs a lot of money. Pharmaceutical companies patent those drugs. Under the bill, it says they get to patent it for 20 years. And that means that no other company gets to come in with that formula of drug for that 20-year period of time. And that pharmaceutical company is basically given a monopoly for that drug. There's a reason for why you want that. If you spent a lot of money to develop that drug, you want to incentivize the pharmaceutical company to both recoup its investment and also make a profit on it so that they do it again, right? Because we want pharmaceutical companies investing in medical research and development of new medications and new drugs. I mean, we all want cure, well, me probably more than y'all, because I'm closer, want cures for Alzheimer's and dementia, you know? But we all want cures for cancer and things of that nature. Why would you not want to have a 20-year patent? Well, because a prescription for Demenxis or any other prescription drug, if it's a name brand sold by the person who has the patent on it, is going to cost exponentially more money than if you get a generic prescription for that medication. And so what this bill tries to do, I suppose, is to kind of split the baby, where we're going to give you guys the patent, but we're not going to make the patent as long, which means we're going to cut into how long you can make a profit off that, how long you have a monopoly of that drug, and we're going to cut it down so that generics can get to the market with that drug faster, so that we, as a community, can get to more affordable, generic, non-name brand prescription drugs quicker, right? Those are kind of the two underlying premises for this patent, why this patent exists in this context, and why you might want to have that patent there for 20 years, and why you might want to decrease that patent in 10 years. You can come up with other reasons that flow from those two things. I'll let you guys do that. You know? All right, what do I want to hit next? Let's talk about let's talk about the tariffs. So this bill proposes to repeal an executive proclamation by, what was it, Johnson? That imposed 25% tariff on all foreign light trucks, which they've got defined for you. It's basically all consumer vehicles, right? Cars, trucks, vans, anything less than 6,000 pounds is not a motorcycle or truck. Okay, let's talk about what the purpose of tariffs are. Y'all familiar with tariffs at all, what they do? Okay. Essentially, a tariff is a tax on foreign imported goods. So in this example, it's a tax upon foreign imported goods that are cars manufactured by Honda, Hyundai, Mitsubishi, Ferrari if you can afford it, Mercedes, BMWs, et cetera, et cetera. The purpose behind a tariff is it's basically a protective measure, right? So we have a homegrown industry. We've got automotive manufacturers in Detroit, like Ford and GM and Chevy and Dodge and Jeep and Chrysler and their affiliates like Lincoln. If we want those auto manufacturers to be competitive in the United States, you know, they're based here in the United States, we want them to make a profit here in the United States. And so if you impose a tariff upon foreign imported vehicles, what that does is it makes the foreign imported vehicles more expensive. Like what we were talking about, like the minimum wage, right? Honda and Hyundai are not going to eat into their profits in order to pay an extra 25% tariff. What are they going to do? They're going to pass that cost on down to your consumer, the person who buys the vehicle. And so if you're going and shopping for a car and you've got the choice between a Ford or Honda, and the Honda is, more than 25% cheaper than the Ford is, which car are you more likely to buy? You're more likely to buy the Honda because it's a lot cheaper. If you impose a tariff upon that, now the Honda goes up by 25%. It may still be a little bit cheaper than the Ford, but are you more likely to buy the Ford or the GM or the Chevy if the price of the cost difference is not that much? You're not more likely to do it? You wouldn't be, okay? Anybody be more likely to buy an American-made vehicle? Okay, you would be. So that's the point of the tariff, okay? There's reasons for why you want a tariff like this. There's reasons for why you wouldn't want a tariff like this. Why you want it is because it helps American companies. Why would you not want a tariff like this? Okay, it decreases competition. Tell me more about that.
Well, I mean, if you're a really rich person, you're not going to really mind like a slight markup,
Mhm.
mega wealthy. But for the average person in the car market, they're not looking for necessarily the greatest. They want something to get them from point A to point B. The cheaper option is always going to look better.
Okay, and so that forces American companies to be more competitive
Yeah.
and less costs.
There's less competition from, say, like Honda or
Okay, all right, so it decreases
cheaper
competition.
vehicles, yeah.
Right. The other thing it does is, of course, it deprives the American populace of a cheaper vehicle, right? You got to pay more money to get a vehicle that takes you from point A to point B than you otherwise could get if you didn't have a tariff. That make sense, y'all?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. I want to talk about the euthanasia one. The death penalty one is interesting, but a lot of things that we talked about in the context of you punish someone as a juvenile or you punish them as an adult, a lot of those same rationales can be applied to whether you want a death penalty or you don't want a death penalty, right? The things that we talked about in terms of is the criminal justice system an effective deterrent of crime, either by other people or from reoffenders, right? Does it deter recidivism? You can make those same arguments for and against the death penalty that you make for and against stiffer punishment in the context of juvenile offenses. Before I hit upon the euthanasia, the assisted suicide stuff, does anyone have any questions for me in the death penalty context? Anything that you guys want to talk about? No. Okay. All right. Then we'll hit up the assisted suicide bill. One thing kind of on nomenclature on this. There's a distinction between euthanasia and potentially assisted suicide. If you look at the bill, and there's one state that I know of here in the United States that has an assisted suicide bill, or what's called a right to death bill, and that's the state of Oregon. What that bill provides, what is assisted suicide with right to death, is it permits a medical provider to prescribe a lethal medication. The patient has to take that medication in their own power. Okay? That is somewhat different from euthanasia, which is where the physician will administer a lethal drug to a patient, which will end the patient's life. Okay? So there's kind of right off the bat a nomenclature thing that gives you something to talk about. Is this an assisted suicide bill where the physician can prescribe the medication but the patient has to take it on their own? Or is this a bill that allows you to euthanize a patient that you're administering by like a lethal injection, some life-altering drug? I like the Fair Labor Standards Act bill we talked about. I would go through this bill with a fine-tooth comb. I would look at every sentence in this bill, and I would ask yourself, what does this language in this sentence mean, and what effect would this have? Because there are certain protections on the Oregon bill that are in place, or the Oregon statute that are in place, that are not really discussed here. For example, in the Oregon statute, you have to have 2 medical professionals that give a diagnosis or a prognosis that the patient is terminally ill and has 6 months or less to live. Okay, I don't see that here. Okay. All right. What's that?
Oh, no, nothing.
All right. Okay, you guys can resume your conversation. I'm going to regain my train of thought here. We're sitting right at 1 o'clock. I'm just going to say a couple of things instead of opening it up to y'all. This is really an ethics debate. In a lot of ways, it's an ethics debate. It is, do you think someone who is terminally ill or someone who has a life-threatening condition should have the right to request a physician to either assist them or prescribe them a drug or administer a drug that would be lethal to them? And a lot of this comes down to what your values are, you know, and you can make an argument here that that should not be done. You can make an argument here that people should have the autonomy to make that decision for themselves. There's all kinds of arguments that you can come up with for and against from that perspective. One thing that I'd like to kind of recommend to you or suggest to you when you're thinking through this is what protections does this bill, as drafted, provide to the patient? Doctors are not infallible. Doctors can render a diagnosis for a condition and they could be wrong, even if well-intentioned. You've got patients who are given terminal diagnoses that they're going to live 6 months, 3 months, and they wind up living for years and years. You even have some cases where patients, and I think that one of the high profile, I only vaguely recall this, was a lady who was on life support and who was essentially in a coma, and the decision was made to take her off of life support, and the anticipation was that she would pass away without assisted life support, and she wound up living for an additional, I don't know how many years, a number of years, even though no life support was being administered to her. Another thing to consider is if you're a terminally ill patient, and the bill has some mention here about having to see I can't remember exactly, professional psychiatric counsel prior to the decision. A lot of people who are terminally ill are in excruciating pain. And people who are terminally ill and who are in excruciating pain oftentimes are accompanied with clinical depression and with the emotional trauma and distress that comes along with having a terminal illness that causes a whole host of symptoms, including excruciating pain. And the question that you guys might ask yourself is, what protections does this provide, and are those protections sufficient for those people who may be making a decision about assisted suicide or euthanasia when they are not necessarily of sound mind? even if they're not formally, non-compass mentis, what the law would say, someone who does not have capacity to make decisions on their own, somebody who has, in addition to terminal illness, dementia, Alzheimer's, where they physically are incapable of making decisions for themselves. Does a guardian have to make those decisions for them? Can a guardian make a decision for them? Can someone who has a medical power of attorney for a patient, can they make the decision to have medication prescribed and administered that would end the patient's life? Is this a decision that's really coming from the patient, or is this coming from patient caregivers and persons around them? And if it's coming from patient caregivers and people around them, does the bill provide protections to protect the patient from those other people making decisions on their behalf? Okay, I've eaten up all my time, y'all. Any other last final questions for me about any of the bills before I sit down and stop talking?
Not perfect.
Nope, I've covered everything.
I